The plumber's voice cracked over the phone. "Ma'am, don't call anyone, just come home. I think your husband hid an entire room behind this wall." My blood turned cold. For a second I couldn't remember how to breathe. I had just pulled into the parking lot at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Alexandria. Sunday mornings had become predictable over the past year. I'd arrive a little early, sit quietly in my car with a cup of coffee from Starbucks, and gather enough strength to walk inside by myself. A year earlier, I had never imagined I'd be attending church alone. "My husband," I finally managed to ask. "Yes, ma'am." Mike Hernandez sounded different than he had an hour earlier. Calm wasn't a word I'd use anymore. He sounded unsettled. "I think you need to see this yourself." "What exactly did you find?" A long silence. "I'd rather not say over the phone." Another pause. "And Mrs. Collins?" "Yes? Please come alone." The line went dead. I stared through the windshield toward the church entrance where families were greeting one another with hugs and smiles. Children chased each other across the sidewalk while older couples walked arm in arm. I put the car back into reverse. Whatever was waiting at home suddenly mattered more than Sunday Mass. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 58 years old, and for 34 years I was married to General Thomas Collins, a 4-star Army officer who dedicated nearly every waking hour of his life to serving this country. People who knew him through television interviews or Pentagon briefings saw a disciplined leader with perfect posture and carefully measured words. The man I married laughed at terrible jokes. He burned pancakes every Father's Day because he insisted on making breakfast himself. He cried when we lost our first Labrador. And every Friday night, no matter how busy life became, he insisted we watch an old Western movie together. Those ordinary moments are what I missed most. Thomas died 1 year earlier. No warning, no long illness. Just a heart attack while preparing for a meeting at the Pentagon. By lunchtime, my entire world had changed. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery remains a blur even now. The caisson carrying his flag-draped casket, soldiers in dress uniforms standing perfectly still despite the cold wind, the 21-gun salute echoing across the cemetery. Someone folded the American flag with careful precision before placing it into my hands. I remember thinking how strange it was that 34 years of marriage could somehow be represented by a triangle of blue fabric covered in white stars. Since then, I'd learned how lonely a quiet house could be. Life eventually settled into routines. Morning walks with Bailey, our aging yellow Labrador. Coffee at Starbucks on Duke Street. Shopping at Wegmans every Thursday because it was less crowded than weekends. Calling our daughter Emily in North Carolina every Sunday evening. Trying not to spend too much time sitting outside Thomas's old home office. I hadn't changed much in that room. His books still lined the shelves. Military photographs remained on the walls. His reading glasses rested beside an unopened notebook exactly where he'd left them. For months, I couldn't bring myself to touch anything. Then the leak started. At first, it was just a faint water stain near one corner of the ceiling. Within a week, paint began bubbling down one wall. Our insurance company recommended fixing it before mold became a problem. A neighbor suggested Mike Hernandez. "Good plumber," she said. "Former Navy, honest guy." She was right. Mike arrived exactly when he promised. Mid-40s, friendly smile, Navy veteran's cap faded from years of use. "You served?" I asked after noticing the cap. 22 years, he answered. "Retired chief." Thomas would have liked him. They probably would have spent an hour swapping stories before ever looking at a pipe. Instead, Mike got straight to work while I made coffee in the kitchen. Around 10:30, he called from upstairs. "Mrs. Collins." "I'll be right there." He pointed toward the damaged wall. I found where the pipe's leaking, but what? He frowned. "Something doesn't make sense." He tapped gently against the drywall. Instead of the hollow sound you'd expect, there was solid steel. He knocked again. "Same sound." "I've renovated hundreds of homes," he said quietly. "I've never seen this." Neither had I. Thomas and I had lived here for 26 years. I knew every hallway, every closet, every squeaky floorboard. There shouldn't have been steel inside that wall. Mike carefully removed another section of drywall. More steel appeared. Then electrical wiring. Heavy-duty wiring. Not ordinary household electrical lines. The look on Mike's face changed. This wasn't added recently. How old? Hard to say. He brushed away insulation. There. I stepped closer. A narrow outline, almost invisible beneath layers of construction. A door. Not wood. Steel. Perfectly concealed. "No," I whispered. Mike looked at me. You didn't know? I slowly shook my head. Thomas had never mentioned anything like this. Not once. That was when my phone rang. Emily, I almost answered. Instead, I silenced it. Something inside me said this moment belonged only to Thomas and me. Mike examined the door. No keypad. No handle. He searched along the frame before pressing gently beneath a narrow metal strip. A hidden latch clicked. Both of us jumped. The heavy door moved inward only an inch. Cold air drifted out. Fresh. Dry. Not the stale smell you'd expect from a room sealed for years. Lights flickered on automatically. Motion sensors. I stared at Mike. He stared back. I think, he said softly. You should go in first. The room wasn't large. Maybe 12 feet by 15. No windows. Concrete walls. Metal shelving from floor to ceiling. Every shelf perfectly organized. Dozens. No. Hundreds. Of black binders. Each labeled with dates. Several military challenge coins rested inside display cases. Rows of old cassette tapes. Boxes filled with external hard drives. Photographs. Folders. Locked document cases. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked intentional. Meticulous. Exactly like Thomas. On a wooden desk sat a single manila envelope. My name was written across the front. Not typed. Handwritten. In Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. Only Margaret. My knees suddenly felt weak. Mike remained near the doorway. I'll wait outside. I nodded without speaking. The room became completely silent after he stepped away. For several moments I simply stared at the envelope. My husband had prepared this, not for anyone else. For me. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was one sheet of cream-colored paper. Nothing more. Only one sentence. I read it once. Then again. The words refused to make sense. If you're reading this, they finally know I'm dead. For several long seconds, I couldn't take my eyes off that single sentence. If you're reading this, they finally know I'm dead. It wasn't just what Thomas had written. It was the way he'd written it. His handwriting was steady, neat, exactly as I'd seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, and the notes he'd tucked into my suitcase whenever I traveled to visit our daughter. There wasn't a trace of panic in those words. Only certainty. Behind me, Mike knocked lightly on the steel door. Mrs. Collins. I'm all right, I answered, though my voice barely sounded like my own. You sure? I just need another minute. He didn't press. Maybe that's why I trusted him from the beginning. After 22 years in the Navy, he seemed to understand when silence was the kindest thing a person could offer. I looked back inside the envelope. There was something else folded beneath the first page. A handwritten letter. Across the top, Thomas had written, "Read this first, then decide whether to open anything else." I sat in the chair at the small wooden desk. It was the same model he'd once kept in his Pentagon office. I recognized the worn leather armrests where his wedding ring had left faint scratches over the years. I unfolded the letter. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then two things have happened. First, I've died before finishing what I started. Second, someone believes my death means this room is finally safe to search. That assumption may save your life. I stopped reading. Tears blurred the page. Thomas always called me Maggie when it was just the two of us. Never Margaret. Never, honey. Always Maggie. I took a slow breath and kept reading. I need you to believe something that will be difficult. Everything I kept from you, I kept because I loved you, not because I doubted you. If you had known what I was investigating, you would have been in danger long before now. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Danger. Thomas had spent decades in the Army. Danger was part of his profession. But he'd never brought it home. At least that's what I'd always believed. I spent nearly an hour reading. Mike never interrupted. Thomas explained that 12 years earlier, while reviewing procurement reports, he'd noticed something odd. The same military equipment was being purchased repeatedly through different contractors. The paperwork looked legitimate. The prices did not. Millions of taxpayer dollars had disappeared through contracts that technically existed, but delivered little or nothing. At first, he assumed it was accounting mistakes. Then he found altered invoices, fake shipping records, companies that existed only on paper. Every answer led to another question. Eventually, he realized the fraud reached far beyond one contract. It stretched across years, across agencies, across people who held positions of enormous influence. Thomas had quietly begun collecting evidence, not during official investigations, during evenings, weekends, business trips, whenever he could verify something without attracting attention. One sentence caught my attention more than any other. I stopped trusting the system after the third investigation leaked before it officially began. I frowned. Thomas believed someone inside law enforcement had been warning suspects. He wasn't accusing every investigator. Quite the opposite. He wrote that there were many honorable agents. He simply didn't know which ones were safe. So he trusted almost no one. The next binder I opened contained copies of contracts, thousands of pages, highlighted sections, sticky notes, cross-references. Thomas had turned the shelves into a private research library. Nothing was random. Everything connected. Then I opened another binder. Inside were photographs, meetings, restaurants, parking garages, handshakes. Most were ordinary. Until I recognized one face, Richard Boone. I stared at the picture. No, Richard had been Thomas's executive aide for nearly 20 years. If Thomas was speaking somewhere, Richard was nearby. If Thomas traveled overseas, Richard handled the logistics. He knew our anniversary. He attended Emily's graduation. When Thomas died, Richard cried harder than almost anyone. He helped carry the casket at Arlington. After the funeral, he'd hugged me and whispered, "The general was the finest man I've ever known." Now I looked at a photograph of Richard shaking hands with a man Thomas had circled in red. Beneath it, Thomas had written only 4 words. Meeting never reported. Another photograph. Richard entering an office building. Different date. Different city. Again, Thomas had written notes in the margin. I felt sick. No, there has to be another explanation. I wanted there to be one. More than anything. When I finally stepped outside, Mike was sitting quietly on the hallway floor drinking bottled water. He immediately stood. "You okay?" "I don't know." He studied my face. "I've seen that look before." "In the Navy." He nodded. Usually after someone opened a letter they weren't expecting. I managed a weak smile. I think my husband had an entire second life. Mike didn't ask questions. Instead, he looked toward the hidden room. "What do you want to do?" I thought about calling Emily. Then I imagined her driving 6 hours in a panic. "No, not yet. I need time." He nodded. "I can come back tomorrow and finish repairing the leak." "Please." As he packed his tools, he hesitated. "Mrs. Collins." "Yes. Maybe don't mention this room to many people." I looked at him. "I wasn't planning to." "Good." He lowered his voice. "Because somebody spent a lot of money building that room." That evening, I locked every door before taking Bailey for his usual walk around the neighborhood. The July air hung heavy over Alexandria. Children rode bicycles. Neighbors watered gardens. Nothing seemed different. Yet everything felt different. Halfway around the block, Bailey stopped walking. He stared toward the street. A black SUV sat beneath a maple tree. Engine running. Dark windows. I couldn't see inside. After a few seconds, it slowly drove away. I told myself I was imagining things. People parked on residential streets every day. Still, the sight stayed with me. The next afternoon, I drove to Wegmans for groceries. When I came out with 2 bags, I noticed the same model SUV parked across the lot. Maybe it wasn't the same vehicle. Maybe dozens looked identical. But when I glanced toward it, it pulled away before I could read the license plate. For the first time since Thomas's funeral, I felt genuinely afraid. Not because I knew what was happening, because I didn't. That night I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, Bailey began growling downstairs. Not barking, growling. Low, steady. I reached for my phone. Every sound inside the house suddenly seemed louder. A creak. Then another. Someone was inside. I called 911 with shaking hands and locked myself in the bedroom until officers arrived minutes later. They searched the house. No one remained. Nothing appeared stolen. The back door showed signs of forced entry. One officer asked if anything valuable had been taken. I don't know. Then I remembered the hidden room. I ran downstairs. The steel door stood slightly open. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. The binders remained exactly where I'd left them. The hard drives. The tapes. The photographs. Nothing was missing. Then I noticed a single sheet of white paper lying in the center of Thomas's desk. There were only 2 handwritten words. "Stop looking." The words "stop looking" stayed on Thomas's desk long after the police left. One of the Fairfax County officers slipped on a pair of gloves, carefully picked up the note, and placed it into an evidence bag. He asked if anyone besides me knew about the hidden room. I looked at Mike. He looked back at me. "Just the 2 of us," I answered. The officer nodded, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. "We'll increase patrols through the neighborhood for a few nights, Mrs. Collins." "I appreciate that." If you notice anything unusual, call us immediately." I thanked him and watched the patrol cars disappear down the quiet street. Then I closed the steel door for the first time. The heavy latch clicked into place. Somehow that sound made the house feel less secure instead of more. The next morning I called Mike before 8. "I figured you'd call," he said. "You did." I couldn't stop thinking about that room. "Can you come over? I'm already loading my truck." 45 minutes later, he was standing in my kitchen with 2 coffees from Starbucks. "I guessed you didn't sleep much." "I didn't." He handed me one of the cups. "You look like my wife did after our son totaled her car." I laughed despite myself. "It wasn't that bad." "Oh, believe me," he said with a grin. "She looked ready to arrest somebody." That tiny moment of humor felt strangely comforting. It reminded me that ordinary life still existed outside the nightmare I'd stumbled into. I led Mike back upstairs. The hidden room looked exactly as it had the night before, except now neither of us saw it as a curiosity. It was evidence. "I think we need help," Mike said quietly. "I agree. But not just anybody." I nodded. Thomas's letter echoed in my mind. I stopped trusting the system after the 3rd investigation leaked. Who could I trust? I walked over to one of the shelves and opened another binder. Near the front was a yellow sticky note. "If anything happens to me, Susan Blake." No title. Just a phone number. I frowned. "Do you know who Susan Blake is?" Mike shook his head. I searched through several more folders until I found her name again. This time Thomas had written, "Retired Army CID, honest, doesn't scare easily." If Thomas trusted her, that was enough for me. Susan Blake answered on the 3rd ring. "This is Susan. My name is Margaret Collins." A pause. "General Collins' wife?" "Yes." Another pause. Then her voice softened. "I was sorry to hear about Tom." "You knew him." "For nearly 15 years. I found something." Silence. "What kind of something?" "I don't think I should explain over the phone." She didn't hesitate. "I'll be there this afternoon." Susan arrived in an aging silver Ford Explorer instead of the black government SUV I'd half expected. She was in her early 60s with short gray hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. No makeup. No unnecessary conversation. She shook my hand firmly. "I'm Susan." "Thank you for coming." She looked around before stepping inside. Old habits, I guessed. Mike introduced himself. "Navy?" Susan asked after noticing the logo on his shirt. 22 years. She smiled. My father would have approved. That was the closest thing to small talk she offered. When I opened the hidden room, she didn't gasp. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she slowly walked around the shelves reading labels. Then she stopped. "Oh, Tom." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He actually finished it." "You knew." "I knew he was building a case." She turned toward me. "I had no idea he'd documented this much." For nearly 3 hours, the 3 of us worked through the files. Susan approached everything like an investigator. Every binder stayed in order. Every document went back exactly where it belonged. She made notes in a small notebook she carried. Eventually, she stopped at one shelf. "Margaret." I walked over. She pointed to several cassette tapes. "Have you listened to these?" "No." "We should." Fortunately, Thomas had left an old cassette player on the desk. Susan inserted the first tape. Static filled the room. Then Thomas's voice, strong, calm, completely alive. "If anyone besides me is listening to this recording," he said, "it means circumstances have changed." I closed my eyes. Hearing his voice after a year felt almost unbearable. Mike quietly lowered his head. Even Susan swallowed hard. Thomas continued. "I've reached a point where I can no longer assume I'll have time to finish documenting everything." He wasn't frightened. He sounded practical. Like he was recording meeting notes. The tape clicked. Another recording began. "I've had chest pain for several weeks." I looked sharply at Susan. Thomas had never told me that. Not once. I've ignored it longer than I should have. My eyes filled with tears. "You stubborn man," I whispered. He kept talking. "If something happens to me naturally, some people will believe they no longer have anything to fear." Susan stopped the tape. "What is it?" I asked. He knew. Knew what? That his health was failing. I sat down slowly. Thomas hadn't expected to live forever. He had planned for the possibility that his own body, not an enemy, might end the investigation first. We continued listening. One recording changed everything. Thomas mentioned Richard Boone. I held my breath. "I don't believe Richard is directing this operation." Susan looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Thomas continued. Richard has attended meetings he shouldn't have attended. A pause. I believe he's following instructions from someone above him. Mike frowned. So Boone isn't the boss? Susan nodded slowly. That's what Tom believed. The next tape mentioned names I had never heard. Corporate executives, lobbyists, consultants. Then one name stood out. A United States senator's son. Not the senator himself, his son. The recording stopped before Thomas explained further. I stared at the machine. This is bigger than I imagined. Susan nodded. Much bigger. That evening after Susan left with a list of documents to cross-reference not the originals, only handwritten notes, I remained alone in the hidden room. The shelves suddenly looked overwhelming. Hundreds of binders. Thousands of pages. Years of Thomas's life. Years he'd carried this burden without telling me. I reached for one binder. Then another. Eventually I stopped. What am I doing? I whispered into the empty room. I can't do this. I carried 3 binders upstairs. Then 5 more. Finally, I stacked nearly a dozen beside the fireplace. Mike had stayed behind to finish repairing the leak. He walked into the living room just as I struck a match. What are you doing? I'm ending this. He stepped forward. Margaret, I'm tired. The match trembled between my fingers. I've already lost my husband. I know. I don't want to lose whatever's left of my life. Mike gently took the match from my hand. Then he looked directly into my eyes. The general spent 12 years protecting this evidence. I didn't answer. He trusted somebody. My voice cracked. He trusted me. Mike nodded. Then don't let grief make the decision he spent 12 years preparing you to make. I looked toward the fireplace. Then at the binders. Finally, I carried every one of them back into the hidden room. 3 days later, a certified envelope arrived by overnight delivery. No return address. Inside was a federal subpoena demanding that I surrender all documents, recordings, storage devices, and written materials belonging to General Thomas Collins within 24 hours. Susan examined it under the kitchen light. Something about her expression changed immediately. She looked at me, then at Mike. Finally, she spoke. This, she paused, doesn't look right. Susan didn't touch the subpoena for several seconds. She leaned closer to the kitchen island, reading every line twice before setting it down again. It looks official, I said. That's the problem. I frowned. What do you mean? She pointed to the seal at the top of the page. See this? It says Department of Justice. It does. So, the seal is slightly outdated. Most people would never notice. She slid the document toward me. And this case number. I looked down. It isn't formatted correctly. Mike folded his arms. So somebody made a fake subpoena. Susan nodded. A very convincing one. My stomach tightened. Which means, they're scared, she said. They think you have something they can't afford to let the government see. For the first time since discovering the hidden room, I stopped feeling like a frightened widow. If someone was willing to forge federal documents just to get Thomas's files, then everything he'd written was probably true. That afternoon, Susan made several phone calls from my dining room. She never used speakerphone. She never said more than necessary. When she finally hung up, she looked relieved. I reached someone I trust. At the Justice Department. No, she smiled faintly. Someone who used to work there. So the subpoena, fake. There it was, the word I'd been expecting. 100% fake. Mike let out a slow whistle. That's bold. Susan nodded. It also tells us something important. They're losing control, I said. She looked at me with quiet approval. Exactly. The next question was what to do with the evidence. Keeping everything inside my house no longer seemed wise. Neither did handing it to people I didn't know. Susan suggested making copies, not just digital copies, she said. Paper copies too. Mike volunteered immediately. My brother owns a print shop in Springfield. Can he keep his mouth shut? Mike laughed. He survived 3 deployments with me. I trust him. Over the next 2 days, we worked almost non-stop. The hidden room became an assembly line. I organized binders. Susan cataloged documents. Mike scanned files and copied hard drives. Every document was logged. Every storage device was labeled. By Thursday evening, we had created 3 complete sets. One stayed hidden in the room. One Susan locked inside a secure storage unit. The third disappeared somewhere Mike refused to tell me. The fewer people who know, he said with a grin, the better. For once I didn't argue. Late Friday morning, Susan called. I've arranged a meeting. With who? A journalist. I hesitated. I don't know. I understand. I've never spoken to the media. You won't be speaking to the media. She paused. You'll be speaking to one man. His name was Daniel Brooks. Susan described him as an investigative reporter who had spent years exposing government fraud without chasing headlines for attention. He verifies before he publishes. Can he be trusted? I wouldn't be bringing him into this otherwise. We met Daniel at a small diner in Old Town Alexandria. It wasn't fancy. Just good coffee, homemade pie, and people who minded their own business. Daniel looked younger than I'd expected. Early 40s. Dark blue sport coat. Wire rim glasses. A notebook that already looked half full before we even sat down. He shook my hand. Mrs. Collins? Please call me Margaret. And you can call me Daniel. He ordered black coffee. Nothing else. I've read General Collins's public reports over the years, he said. He had a reputation for precision. I smiled. That's an understatement. Susan slid a thin folder across the table. These are copies. Daniel opened it. His expression changed within seconds. He stopped talking. Stopped drinking his coffee. Just read. Finally, he looked up. Where did these come from? My husband. Did anyone else know he had this? Not until last week. Daniel closed the folder carefully. If these documents are authentic, they are. This could become one of the largest procurement fraud investigations in decades. I stared out the window. People walked past carrying shopping bags. A couple laughed while sharing an ice cream cone. Life continued outside that diner as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Over the following week, Daniel worked quietly. He never rushed. Every claim had to be confirmed. Every signature compared. Every contract verified. Sometimes he'd call with a simple question. Margaret, did Tom ever mention this company? Or, do you recognize this address? He wasn't trying to build a dramatic story. He was trying to build a truthful one. Thomas would have appreciated that. Not everything was serious. One afternoon, Mike managed to remind us that laughter still existed. We were reorganizing shelves inside the hidden room when he accidentally bumped the steel door. It swung shut. The automatic lock engaged. From inside, Susan and I stared at each other. Then we heard Mike's voice through the thick steel. Well, a pause. This is embarrassing. Susan tried the hidden latch. Nothing. You okay in there? I've got plenty of reading material. I couldn't help it. I laughed. A real laugh. The first one since Thomas's funeral. Even Susan smiled. After several minutes, Mike discovered the emergency release lever Thomas had installed on the inside wall. The door opened. Mike stepped out holding one of Thomas's challenge coins. I think the general planned for idiots like me. I laughed again. So did I. It felt good. Not because anything was funny, because for a few seconds grief loosened its grip. The following Monday my doorbell rang. I looked through the sidelight window. Richard Boone. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders sagged. The confidence that had once surrounded him was gone. I considered pretending I wasn't home. Instead, I opened the door. Richard? Margaret? His voice barely rose above a whisper. May I come in? I stepped aside. Neither of us spoke until we reached the living room. He noticed Thomas's favorite chair, then looked away. I know you found his files. I froze. How? I guessed. My heartbeat quickened. Richard rubbed his hands together. I've carried this for years. He looked directly at me. I'm sorry. For what? For betraying him. The words landed like a punch. I sat down slowly. Richard remained standing. I accepted money. I couldn't speak. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone. His eyes filled with tears. They only wanted schedules. He swallowed hard. Meeting locations? He shook his head. I never believed they'd use the information the way they did. You lied to Thomas. Yes. You lied to me. Yes. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he whispered, I would have traded every dollar to undo it. I wanted to hate him. Part of me did. But another part saw a broken old man carrying guilt that had aged him far beyond his years. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly. I understand. He nodded. I don't expect you to. He stood. If the truth finally comes out, he paused. I'll testify. Then he walked out the front door without looking back. 2 days later, Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually tense. Margaret? What happened? I've verified enough. So, I'm scheduling publication. I smiled for the first time all day. Thomas would be happy. I hope so. There was a long pause. Daniel, If anything happens, what do you mean? The line went silent, then disconnected. I called back immediately. No answer. The next morning, Daniel Brooks had disappeared. I called Daniel 6 times before breakfast. Each call went straight to voicemail. By noon, I'd convinced myself the worst had happened. Susan, on the other hand, stayed remarkably calm. "Don't assume anything yet," she said as she set her coffee on my kitchen table. "He wouldn't disappear without a reason." "But he was worried." "Exactly." She folded her hands. "And good investigative reporters prepare for situations like this." Mike looked up from his laptop. "You think he went underground?" Susan nodded. "If he uncovered what I think he uncovered, disappearing for a few days might have been the safest decision he could make." I wanted to believe her. Still, every hour without news felt heavier than the last. 3 days later, my phone rang from an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. number. "Mrs. Collins?" "Yes." "This is Daniel." I nearly dropped the phone. "Where are you?" "I'm safe." "What happened?" "I can't explain everything yet." His voice sounded tired but steady. "Federal investigators contacted me after I shared copies of your husband's evidence." "So you've been with them?" "More or less." "They advised me not to contact anyone until they verified the documents independently." I closed my eyes. "So they believe Tom—" "They do now." He paused. "And Margaret?" "Yes, they've opened a formal investigation." For the first time in over a year, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again.
Hope.
The following week, 2 officials from the Department of Justice arrived at my house. They introduced themselves, showed proper identification, and patiently answered every question Susan asked before anyone stepped inside. Only then did I realize how different genuine professionals behaved from people trying to imitate them. They never pressured me. They never demanded immediate access. They explained every step. One attorney looked around Thomas's hidden room and quietly said, "I've never seen evidence organized this thoroughly." I smiled through tears. Neither had I. Over several hours, they carefully documented every binder, every hard drive, every cassette tape, and every handwritten note. Nothing was removed without a receipt. Nothing happened without my signature. When they finally left, the hidden room felt strangely lighter. Thomas had spent 12 years carrying this burden alone. Now, at last, other honest people were carrying part of it with him. The investigation moved quickly after that. Search warrants were issued. Financial records were subpoenaed. Executives who had once acted untouchable suddenly hired expensive defense attorneys. Television news stations began reporting on a widening federal procurement investigation. No names were released. Not yet. But I recognized enough details to know they were following Thomas's trail. Richard Boone called one evening. "They asked me to testify." "Will you?" "Yes." His voice cracked. "It's time." Several months later, I found myself walking up the broad stone steps of the Fairfax County Courthouse. Television cameras lined the sidewalk. Reporters spoke quietly into microphones. Veterans wearing old unit caps stood beside military families holding small American flags. Some recognized Thomas's photograph from the news. Several stopped me. "Your husband served with honor." "We're praying for you. He deserved better." I thanked each one. Not because I enjoyed the attention, because every kind word reminded me that Thomas hadn't been forgotten. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Government attorneys, defense lawyers, journalists, military officers, curious citizens. The air felt heavy with anticipation. When I took the witness stand, I noticed Richard seated several rows away. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. His shoulders were bent. When our eyes met, he gave a slight nod. I returned it. Not as forgiveness, simply as acknowledgement. The prosecutor began gently. "Mrs. Collins, how long were you married to General Thomas Collins?" 34 years. "Did you know your husband maintained a concealed archive inside your home?" "No." "When did you first discover it?" I described the leaking pipe, Mike's repair, the hidden steel door, the envelope addressed only to me. The room grew silent as I explained, finding hundreds of binders and recordings. Then the prosecutor asked, "Why didn't you destroy the evidence?" I thought carefully before answering. "Because my husband spent 12 years protecting it." I glanced toward the jury. "And because the truth doesn't stop mattering just because the person who found it dies." No one spoke for several seconds. Richard testified the following afternoon. His voice shook throughout most of his testimony. He admitted accepting money. He admitted sharing schedules. He admitted convincing himself the information wasn't important. I told myself nobody would get hurt. The prosecutor asked quietly, Were you wrong? Richard lowered his head. Yes. Tears filled his eyes. The general trusted me. He paused. And I failed him. No one in the courtroom celebrated his confession. There wasn't anything satisfying about watching a man confront the worst decision of his life. Only sadness. The defense attorneys argued aggressively. They questioned dates, signatures, recordings, memory. They suggested Thomas had misunderstood ordinary government procedures. For a while, it seemed the trial might become hopelessly complicated. Then the prosecutor looked toward me. Mrs. Collins. Yes? Did your husband leave anything that has not yet been presented? I nodded slowly. One item. The courtroom became completely still. The prosecutor smiled gently. Would you please describe it? A video. An investigator rolled a television monitor into the courtroom. The lights dimmed. The recording began. Thomas appeared seated behind the same desk that still stood inside the hidden room. He wore a plain blue shirt instead of his army uniform. No medals. No rank. Just my husband. He looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, he began calmly, then someone finally believed the evidence was worth examining. His voice filled the courtroom. For nearly 30 minutes he explained everything. The contracts. The fake companies. The financial transfers. The recorded meetings. The hidden relationships. Each statement matched documents already entered into evidence. Each accusation was supported by records the government had independently verified. Finally, Thomas looked straight into the camera again. If my grandchildren ever ask what happened, he smiled faintly. Tell them I trusted honest people would eventually finish what I couldn't. The screen went black. No one moved. Even the defense attorneys remained silent. Within hours, federal agents executed arrest warrants that had been prepared in advance. Several corporate executives were taken into custody. Additional indictments followed over the next several weeks. The senator whose family had repeatedly appeared throughout the investigation announced his resignation, insisting he had done nothing illegal. Federal investigators continued examining his role. Multiple defense contracts were suspended pending review. Billions of taxpayer dollars would now receive renewed oversight. Justice hadn't happened overnight, but it had happened. Not because of one dramatic moment. Because one man had quietly documented the truth for 12 years and refused to stop. When I returned home that evening, the house felt peaceful for the first time since Thomas died. I walked into the hidden room one last time. Most of the shelves now stood empty. Only a few personal items remained. His favorite fountain pen, a challenge coin, a framed photograph of us at Fort Myer many years earlier, and one final envelope, in Thomas's handwriting. For Maggie when it's finally over. I sat down at his desk, slowly broke the seal, and unfolded the last letter my husband would ever write to me. For a long time I simply held the letter in my hands. The house was quiet except for Bailey's slow footsteps downstairs. He was getting older now. His muzzle had turned almost completely white and he no longer rushed to greet visitors the way he once had. Somehow that felt fitting. We had both grown older during the past year. Outside, a light October rain tapped gently against the windows. It was the kind of steady Virginia rain Thomas always liked. He used to stand on the back porch with a cup of coffee listening to it fall while the rest of the neighborhood hurried indoors. I unfolded the letter. The paper was thicker than the others as though he'd chosen it carefully. At the top, in the same familiar handwriting that had comforted me for 34 years, were 4 simple words. My dearest Maggie. I smiled through tears. Then I began to read. If you've opened this letter, it means the fight is finally over. First, I need you to do something for me. Take a deep breath. I laughed softly. Even now Thomas was giving me instructions. It sounded exactly like him. Second, forgive yourself. I stopped reading. Forgive myself. For what? I hadn't done anything wrong. Or had I? For months after his death, I'd replayed every conversation we'd ever had. Should I have noticed the chest pain? Should I have insisted he retire? Should I have pushed him to see another doctor? Grief has a strange way of inventing responsibilities that were never ours to carry. Thomas seemed to understand that. You were never supposed to save me. You gave me 34 wonderful years. That was more than I ever deserved. I covered my mouth with one hand. The tears came quietly this time, not the overwhelming sobs that had followed his funeral. Just the gentle tears that come when someone you love somehow reaches across time to comfort you. The letter continued. I know you'll be tempted to spend the rest of your life protecting my reputation, defending my choices, and fighting the people who hurt us. Please don't. That sentence surprised me. After everything we'd uncovered, after everything he'd sacrificed, I expected him to tell me to keep fighting. Instead, he wrote, "The evidence was never about revenge. It was about protecting honest soldiers who deserved better leaders." I leaned back in the chair. That was Thomas. Even at the very end, he wasn't thinking about the people who had betrayed him. He was thinking about young men and women who put on a uniform every morning, believing their leaders would do the right thing. He wanted them protected, not himself. Over the following months, life slowly found a new rhythm. The Department of Justice asked whether I would consider donating Thomas's research archive after the criminal cases concluded. Not everything. Some documents still contained classified information that belonged in secure government custody. But thousands of pages documenting procurement fraud, investigative methods, and personal notes could eventually help train future investigators. I agreed. Watching the last boxes leave the hidden room was unexpectedly emotional. For over a year, that room had felt like a place suspended in time. Now it had fulfilled its purpose. The steel shelves stood nearly empty. I ran my hand across the wooden desk one last time. "Goodbye," I whispered. "Not to the room. To the burden it had carried." A few weeks later, Emily came to visit. She walked through the house, slowly noticing the changes. "It feels lighter," she said. "I think it is." She hugged me. "I'm proud of you, Mom." I smiled. "I wasn't very brave." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. "You were brave every single day." Sometimes our children see strengths we've never recognized in ourselves. One afternoon, Mike stopped by to check on a small plumbing repair in the guest bathroom. As always, he refused to leave without accepting a cup of coffee first. We sat on the back patio watching Bailey sleep in the sunshine. "You know," Mike said, "I still can't believe all this started with a leaking pipe." I laughed. "I've thought about that too." He shook his head. "Funny how ordinary things change lives." "They do." He smiled. "I miss the general." "So do I." After a comfortable silence, he added, "I think he'd be happy." "I hope so." "I know so." Richard Boone reached out only once after the trials ended. He didn't ask to meet. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply mailed a short handwritten note. "I'm volunteering 3 days a week at a Veterans Resource Center. It's not enough to erase what I did, but it's a place to begin." I folded the letter and placed it inside one of Thomas's old journals. Redemption isn't something another person can grant. It's something we spend the rest of our lives trying to earn. I hoped Richard understood that. One idea kept returning to me. Thomas had often worried about military families who lost a parent in service or shortly afterward. Education mattered deeply to him, so I met with an attorney and a financial advisor. Several months later, we established the General Thomas Collins Memorial Scholarship, providing annual educational assistance for children of fallen service members from Virginia. The first award ceremony took place at a community center near Fort Myer. Nothing extravagant, just families, veterans, teachers, a few local officials, and a room filled with hope. Mike attended with his wife. Susan came as well, though she insisted on sitting in the back row. Daniel Brooks covered the event not as a major national story, but as a quiet reminder that integrity leaves a legacy long after headlines disappear. As I handed the first scholarship certificate to a 17-year-old whose mother had served in the Army, I thought about Thomas. This was what he had been protecting all along. Not documents, not investigations. People. A year after opening the hidden room, I drove once again to Arlington National Cemetery. The autumn leaves had begun turning shades of gold and crimson. The hills looked peaceful beneath a clear blue sky. I carried a small bouquet of fresh white lilies, Thomas's favorite flowers, to bring me on our anniversary. The cemetery was quiet except for distant footsteps and the occasional sound of flags moving gently in the breeze. I found his headstone easily. I always did. I knelt and placed the flowers beside it. For a while I simply sat there. Not speaking, not crying, just remembering. The first apartment we could barely afford. Road trips with Emily asleep in the back seat. Friday night westerns. Burned pancakes. Laughter. Ordinary days that had become extraordinary simply because we'd shared them. "I finished it," I said softly. "I couldn't have done it without some good people." A breeze moved through the trees. I smiled, not because the grief had disappeared. It never completely does. But because grief had finally found a place where it could rest beside gratitude instead of anger. As I stood to leave, I looked back one last time. The sun had broken through the clouds, warming the white marble rows stretching across the hillside. Thomas's name was carved into stone, but the truth he fought for would live far beyond it. Sometimes people think revenge means watching someone else lose everything. I've learned something different. Sometimes the greatest revenge is refusing to let lies become the final chapter. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it's built one honest decision at a time, and when it finally arrives, it doesn't erase your grief. It simply allows you to carry it with peace instead of bitterness. If this story reminded you that integrity still matters, even when no one is watching, I hope you'll share it with someone who believes the truth is always worth fighting for. Thank you for spending this time with me.